In The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, a scientist from the late 19th century travels over 800,000 years into the future and sees the long-term consequences of some Victorian trends. In this video, I will be reviewing and rating The Time Machine using the 5P system created by my friend Book Gabber on TikTok. The 5P version that I use is purpose, plot, etc., prose, personal, and position. I will give it a rating for each category before getting the average and giving it a final rating. But before I do, I like to have a starting rating based on vibes. I would say the vibes for The Time Machine are 4 out of 5. So let's start with purpose. Why was The Time Machine written? H.G. Wells seemed to be satirizing two things in particular. First was the growing gap between the haves and have-nots, the wealthy and the poor of the Victorian era that had been widening since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Not just widening, but also changing the way that the have-nots were living in ways that he understandably did not like. And the second thing that he was satirizing, or we might say reflecting on, was the growing popularity of the theory of evolution, especially as a challenge to Christianity, which was then the prevalent view. Wells's mood in The Time Machine is optimism, or perhaps I should say positivism, mixed with a lot of ambivalence. He seemed to be excited about the changes being brought about by developments in technology and also how the theory of evolution was changing the way scientists think. But when one is in a rapidly changing age, there's also a great sense of uncertainty. And as I briefly mentioned a few moments ago, this is both a satire and a reflection. He really did seem to think deeply about how the world was changing and about how his own beliefs had changed and how it might not have been possible if he had been born in an earlier era. And what better way to reflect on rapidly changing times than to write a novel in which someone rapidly changes his own time? For purpose, I would give this a 5 out of 5. Now for plot, etc., in which I look at the literary elements of the work. I would say that the elements of The Time Machine fit together so well that I can only compare them to the actual time machine from the novel. And by that, I mean that the book, like the machine, is seemingly engineered with precision to take us into the future. Whether you are riding the actual time machine or reading the novel, The Time Machine, it does its job. The plot is pretty exciting. This is my third time reading it, so I'm fairly familiar with what the time traveler experiences. But I remember the first time I read it, not being sure what would happen next and being surprised. And I imagine that for its first readers, the plot really did keep them guessing. Maybe those of you watching this who have more experience reading science fiction recognize more tropes and would be able to predict what happens next better than I could. But in general, I think that the beats are very well done. I also think there's a really good balance between action and reflection here. This is both a journey through time and, I would say, an emotional journey through the heart of the time traveler, who is often a stand-in for Wells himself. And speaking of the time traveler, the main character and um, well, the secondary narrator, even if he does narrate the bulk of the story, I think he's pretty good. He is believable as a scientist adventurer and a Victorian gentleman. I would say he's also a really good representative of the past. If we had to send someone into the future to represent us, he's a great choice. And by us, I also mean you and I, not just the late Victorians. We are close enough to them that we're practically the same people. And you have to admit that someone 800,000 years into the future would say that we are contemporaries. While the time traveler doesn't really achieve anything, he doesn't even convince all of his friends that he did travel into the future. That's kind of part of the point. This is a novel which hints that human achievement and human intellect may be, in the end, and by the end I mean a million years into the future, these things might ultimately be futile. But the time traveler is not here to make a mark that will last a million years into the future. He is here to make a point about human dignity. We may be pretty ephemeral on the earth as far as natural history goes, but we're also pretty cool. As for the settings, well, of course, they're brilliant, and they are some of the most memorable settings created for science fiction and the adventure genre. The world of the Eloi and the Morlocks alone is really significant and influential. And I say that they're designed and described appropriately. The earth in the future is beautiful. The flora is lush and lovely, but the ruins left by a civilization that is long gone, they are tragic in their decay. The jump even further into the future is frightening. It's straight out of a horror movie. The settings are great. And for all of them together, plot, character, and setting, I give this another 5 out of 5. Now for prose. If I had to describe the prose or the writing style in 3 words, they would be bright, ornate, and cinematic. And when I tried to come up with an image that puts those 3 words together, what I thought of was a very well maintained and shiny classic car with a, a hood ornament, a shiny polished hood ornament that looks really classy. And I'm no expert on automobiles, but I think that, or I associate these big classic cars with an age that saw them as a symbol of the future, where we were headed. And it's kind of appropriate that what was futuristic and forward looking for them is now vintage and maybe a little quaint to us. And similarly, The Time Machine must have been really cutting edge when it was first published, and now it's really showing its age, which doesn't mean it's not a good story. It doesn't mean it can't take us for a good ride. It just means that it is clearly from 1895. There were some moments when I found it a little too late Victorian, and I tried to imagine how it could have been written to seem more timeless. And then I realized how that sounded. Perhaps what I think of as a more classic or timeless writing style would, in a few years, also be a pretty obvious relic of its own age. Now, I tried to be a little more critical of prose because I had just given The Time Machine 2 5s in a row. And then I thought, if I'm trying this hard to find something wrong with it, maybe there isn't really anything wrong with it. And this voice of the time traveler as an educated, cultured, upper class Victorian gentleman is actually pretty perfect. So, okay, prose gets another 5 out of 5. Now for my personal opinion. In case you couldn't tell, I really liked The Time Machine. As I said, this is my third time reading it and the best reading experience so far. The first time I read it, I was pretty resistant to it in the sense that I was theologically opposed to Wells's perspective, and that kept me from being immersed in the story as much as I could have been. I would say that I still disagree with Wells on a lot of things, including his view of God, but this time, with more experience reading, I was able to enter into what Charlotte Bronte has called the language of another mind. And I let Wells take me on the journey he wanted to take me. I let him show me how he saw the world, how he saw time, how he saw science, how he saw his own age, and I was the better for it. I also read up on Wells's life, which made some parts hit harder. For instance, I learned that when he was a child, he lived in a basement with his family, and they had windows that were on street level. So when he looked up, he would see people's feet. And sometimes the people walking past the window were better off societally or financially than his family. And that went into his characterization of the Morlocks as a people living underground. And before I learned this, I had kind of taken for granted that Wells identified more with the Eloi, the refined, educated upper class that eventually became too refined. And it moved me a lot to see that he must have also felt some kinship with the Morlocks. Learning about Wells's childhood made the time traveler's disgust of the Morlocks poignant and actually quite heartbreaking. And I felt that Wells was not just sketching out ideas here, I felt he was showing me his soul. And for that, I also have to give personal a 5 out of 5. Wow, you see where this review is going. So finally, there is position. It's got a great position in the literary canon and the greater culture. The Eloi and the Morlocks alone changed our perception of social class in a way that a million social justice treatises could not have. And since its publication, time travel has become a pretty big subgenre in science fiction. Even if there were time travel stories written before H.G. Wells, what makes The Time Machine uniquely influential is the machine. Time travel to us is associated with some kind of mechanical device that was engineered to do something to physics. Without the time machine, we probably would not have Back to the Future. We probably might not even have The Terminator, one of my favorite movies. We might not even have the Tesseract in A Wrinkle in Time, which was written by Madeleine L'Engle, my favorite author from childhood. And this is not just to be personal about it again. I think it's pretty clear that the time machine has a pretty excellent position, as I define position, using the literary canon and the greater culture. And that's another 5 out of 5. Okay, when I wrote the outline for this video, I genuinely thought that the final rating would be close to the Vibes rating. This is unexpected for me too. I do kind of draft videos in my head while reading the book, but I try not to. I try to be immersed in the reading as much as possible and not jump ahead mentally to the reviewing and to video creation, which is why I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a 4. But then I started thinking about it and wow, okay, so my first perfect 5. I hope not my last. And I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you liked my thoughts, I also have a video essay comparing The Time Machine to the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. It's in my video essays playlist, and the title is Death, Judgment, and Apocalypse in Shelley and Wells.